and learn more about the future of conservation in a crowded American West, and it's becoming all the more crowded. Before we launch the panel, I would like to introduce Laura Drake, who's been our excellent executive director of the festival, to share a few words with you about tonight's events. Laura, you have the floor. You got it.
Good evening, everyone. I have to cheat with glasses and paper. I am Laura Musbach Drake, the Executive Director of the festival, and I just want to thank you so much as we officially open the weekend with tonight's program. This is our 28th anniversary year, and we love to see all the crowds that are gathering. It's a testament to how much people love the sheep and love this festival and love the stories that they've heard and have yet to hear. I'm just curious how many people here are from out of state tonight? Wow, okay, that's half at least. Anyone from out of the country? Oh, usually we have one. Okay. Well, the U.S. is just fine. Last year we had, and you may have seen them at our headquarters or out at the trails, we have people pin themselves on our maps and their hometowns. And last year we had all 50 states and multiple countries represented. So we've become a bucket list festival, and that is a true testament to the story that Diane and John Peavy, our co-founders, wanted to share, the story of Idaho and the story of our land and the story of the sheep. Each year we see about 25,000 people, so word has gotten out that we are here. I do want to take a minute to thank Diane and John. We lost John this year, and for those that knew him, we're having a celebration of life tomorrow night back here, and you're welcome to join us. But it was their passion for their ranch and their animals and Idaho and the land that founded this festival and made it happen. And I just want to take a minute for those of you that may not know the story of our founding. It was the early 90s when our local recreation district wanted to put in a paved bike path for recreators. And they approached the sheep ranchers and they said, we'd like to put in this bike path. And they said, that's just fine, but the sheep are still going to trail up and down this. And everyone agreed, and it was all gloriful and wonderful. And then John's phone started ringing off the hook when he was running again and campaigning to be in the legislature, and said, get your sheep off my bike path because there are things in my rollerblades and my bike wheels and I don't like it. And so Diane Peavy said, why don't you come have coffee with us and then you trail the sheep and you'll see how this works, because there's a lot of history to this region and sheep are part of that, and maybe you just don't know the story. So it started that small, and then next year more people came, and then school kids were coming and teachers were coming, and along with Carol Waller, who was running the chamber at the time, they said, we have a festival here. So it really was born out of a need to preserve stories, make sure people didn't lose the understanding of the culture of our region, and it still continues today for that reason. We have a lot of newcomers to town, so our festival is more popular than ever because we still have stories to share. So thank you for being here tonight to take part in that. And I just want to say some thank yous, and we'll get on with the program. I have to thank our board of directors. Many are in the audience tonight, for keeping this festival running year after year after year. Our advisory council, our investment committee, part of my team, Zole and Lori, greeted you outside. I also need to thank our grand sponsor, which is the Valley Chamber, supported by the Idaho Tourism Council. And our premier sponsors, I'm glad the list is a little long because that means we have good support, so bear with me. The American Border Collie Association, the American Lamb Board, the Gooding Basque Association, the Idaho Commission on the Arts, the Idaho Wool Growers, the Joyce and Doug McCallum, Marcia and Don Liebeck, Sally and Marco Netto, Power Engineers, the Page Foundation, the Team SNEP Charitable Fund, the Martine and Dan Drackett Family Foundation, Thurston Charitable Fund, and the Wood River Women's Foundation. We can't do this as a nonprofit without support, so we're so very grateful. I also just want to thank our media sponsor, Sun Valley Property News, this year, and you can look in your program for all of our wonderful sponsors. Just some quick reminders about the rest of the weekend. The Championship Sheepdog Trials run all day tomorrow from 9 to 5 off of Buttercup Road in Haley. The Folklife Fair is from 10 to 4 tomorrow at Roberta McKercher Park in Haley. Adjacent to the park is the Good Shepherd Monument. That was also a vision of John Peavy's that we installed in 2021. So please take a minute to enjoy the 8 life-sized sheep, herder, horse, and dog while you are there. On Sunday, there are free sheep herding stories on the Limelight patio with Jerry Seifert, our local historian who you just met on the stage, full of great knowledge about this town and this community. John's son, Tom Peavy, who's currently running their Flat Top Ranch, will be there, and Dennis Burks, who's in the middle of our audience tonight and helped manage Flat Top for many, many years. So come out, and it's a great Q&A opportunity. It's a free event for you to ask questions. And of course, it all culminates in the Big Sheep Parade on Sunday at 12 noon when the 1,200 woolies make their way down the street. So we can't wait to celebrate with you all weekend. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jared Talley. He's going to moderate this evening's panel. Jared.
Thanks, everybody. There we go. Welcome, everyone, to our panel discussion, where we'll be thinking about the future of conservation in Crowded West. Hold on. Being tall sucks. I want to particularly thank Lane Justice. Lane, where are you at? You got to be around here. For taking the time and care to organize this whole shebang. I want to thank the Argyros Performing Arts Center for letting us use this beautiful space, the Western Landowners Alliance for helping make this possible, our panelists for sharing their experiences and wisdom, and most importantly, the Trailing of the Sheep for bringing us all together in community. Please join me in thanking our gracious hosts, our sponsors, and our panelists. Thank you. Okay, so here's how the night should go. After I'm done talking, and that should be very shortly, we'll hear from our panelists until around 8, maybe 8:15. Then we'll open up the discussion to audience Q&A. We were initially going to have note cards to write notes on and all that, but we forgot note cards, and that's really critical to that whole plan. So we will now have microphones that you can raise your hand, and we'll bring you a microphone to ask a question, and we'll talk about that at the very end. So let's ask a question. Why are we here, right? And first, I need to ask, why am I here? Like, as a professor at Boise State. And that's functionally why I'm here. I'm an assistant professor with Boise State University's School of Public Service, where my teaching and research are all about Idaho rural communities and the landscapes that are supported by and serve to support these communities. Personally, though, I was born and raised southwest of here, 5th generation to Idaho ranchers, nurses, potato processors, and mechanics. I deeply care about Idaho's gorgeous landscapes and am fortunate to have lived my life with them. But I also deeply care about our rural communities that live on this land. I'm an environmental philosopher that thinks way too much about how we as a people relate to the land. Briefly, that's why I'm here. But there's a troubling idea that I've seen all over the place, and it truly worries me. Simply, I often see people say something to the effect that if we want to protect our landscapes, then we have to remove people and their affairs from the landscape. Conversely, if we want to protect our rural communities, the people, then we must give up care for our landscapes. And frankly, I think this is bullshit. We can do both. And in my experience and all of my travels across the West, I've seen rural communities model exactly what this looks like. Tonight, we'll explore what it means for conservation to deeply care both about our working landscapes and our working communities. A brief note before we begin. Here, I'm thinking of working landscapes as those lands that we use as a community to support our own well-being and livelihoods, but also to provide the resources for us as a society to enjoy. We love our cell phones and make sure they are off, if you have not checked yet, but they take minerals that must be mined. We love our houses, but they take lumber that must be harvested. We love our food and all the culture and community it brings when we come together around it, but it must be grown and stewarded. The lands that do this are, in my opinion, working lands. Lastly, I want to say something about the place I love, and that's Idaho. Certainly, it's gorgeous. And we also have thriving communities around mining, lumber, agriculture, ranching, and more. Also, any environmental issue that really happens in the West happens in some part in Idaho. Salmon recovery, wolf reintroduction, grizzlies, invasive species, water conflict, massive growth, recreation, and the occasional landscape fire caused by someone burning their used toilet paper. This has happened actually twice in recent years, once just a few weeks ago outside of Boise. Conservation is ripe in Idaho. We thrive because we come together in community, and our landscapes thrive and are world-renowned precisely because we do care about them. I now want to turn it over to our panelists. Welcome up to the stage, please, and have them briefly introduce themselves here in a few minutes. I guess I should have invited them up sooner. The best people to introduce someone is themselves. So I want our panelists, in whatever order you all want to, I want you to introduce yourself very briefly. In your introduction, can you please tell us who you are, where you call home, and what your role is in Working Landscapes? Lastly, part of this, I want you to tell us one thing that you hope we take away from this evening's discussion. Anyone can start. Haley.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this conversation. My name is Leslie Allison, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Western Landowners Alliance. We're a West-wide landowner-led, landowner-founded organization working to conserve the working lands, the whole and healthy landscapes that our future depends on. I reside in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I grew up in New Mexico, grew up in the West. And I think that so I come into this work representing a very broad diversity of landowners, a lot of ranchers, folks in forestry, conservation, recreation, all kind of different enterprises. And we come from the full political spectrum. But the thing that brings us together is a love of the land and a commitment to trying to take care of it and keep it whole and healthy for people and wildlife. So the one thing that I think I'd like folks to come away with at the end of this conversation today is the deep importance of private and working lands to the future of both people and wildlife. And our future really will depend on how well we conserve and care for these lands and support the people who are doing that job out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. It's really an honor to be here on this panel and to finally meet Jared. We've joked that we've kind of gone around the state and not bumped into each other, so
Spiraled.
I really appreciate it. My name's Haley Wilmer. I'm a research rangeland management specialist at the USDA Agriculture Research Service, ARS as we call ourselves. We're the research branch of USDA, and we've got little stations all over the country that serve the local agricultural context. In my case, I work at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station, which is at Du Bois, Idaho. So if you've ever been through Du Bois, you've probably stopped at our gas station. And just north of there, there's a 48,000 acre research ranch that operates like a commercial 3,000 head sheep ranch. And I'm lucky enough to get to do range science there. So it's kind of a dream job. I joke that I get to be Haley Wilmer for a living. And I have a really cool team of social scientists, animal scientists, nutrition, genetics, and range that I get to work with in conjunction with the ranching community, cattle, sheep, and conservation around there. I think one thing I would hope folks take away is that we can get better at this living together thing. And I think these landscapes are a place where we can learn to do that. And they have lessons for the rest of the world as well. These are common lands, we often call them, and really as we share kind of a common global sort of conversation around climate change and biodiversity conservation and food systems, I think places where we're forced to live together can teach us a lot about doing that better. So, we've got one.
Thank you, Haley. My name is Sarah Berman. I born and raised in the Wood River Valley, and my husband Ed and I started Squash Blossom Farm about 10 years ago. We grow vegetables, mixed vegetables for the Wood River Valley community here, so super small scale but high intensive production, all sold here within the Wood River Valley. And we also raise a small flock of sheep that we use in our holistic management and to improve the soil for vegetable production. So one thing that I hope that you all can take away is that land stewardship and conservation can kind of come in all different shapes and sizes. It doesn't, it can be a small 6-acre farm, it can be a 3,000 head rangeland operation, or it can be in your backyard, and it can be a private, personal, individual project or big nonprofit government operations. And there's no bad time to start. It's not too late. So I think that we can all take kind of our own version of how to get involved and get better at this.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, first of all, I'm going to apologize for wearing my hat indoors. My poor dear mother is looking down right now, saying, "Get your hat off. You're inside." But I want you to all know I'm honestly doing this for your benefit, and to try and minimize some of the glare. But I'm Mike Gary. I'm a third-generation sheep and cattle rancher from south of here. Down our lower ranch is down west of Twin Falls, out towards Balanced Rock if you've traveled out that way. And then our upper ranch is in the Three Creek country west of Jackpot, Nevada. And our forest, we actually go south to go on the forest, unlike many operations that come this way to go on the forest. And our forest is the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest in northern Nevada. As I say, I'm third generation. My grandfather came as a sheep herder in 1910 from the old country in northern Spain. My father came back to the operation in 1954, and I came back in 1980 after working for a couple of years in the accounting industry in Nevada before I came back to the ranch. Again, we run sheep and cattle. We run yearling cattle also, over to 9-weight cattle in intensive grazing systems, and so have a fairly diverse operation as well. And I guess my one take that I'd like to see us come out of here with is based a little bit on where I see our country today. You know, especially in politics, it seems like we can't disagree anymore unless we hate each other. And I think that's really a sad connotation. And I think it's transcended, unfortunately, into many things in our day-to-day life. And what I'd hope to see come out of this group today when we leave out of here, in both directions, is that we, before we make some of these statements and take some of these positions, we try to walk in the other person's shoes and try to understand some of their challenges and some of their desires and what they want out there on these working lands, and what we as operators want out there on these working lands. And so if we can come out of here tonight with a little better feeling that way, I feel like we'll have made a win. Thank you.
Thanks for the introductions, y'all. Sarah, I want to start with you. What occurs to me as I listen to all of this, what I'm actually hearing is relationships, right? Relationships with the land, relationships with livestock, relationships with community, relationships with place, or other communities in our shared society. And I want to ask you about your relationship with your land, your connection, but particularly, what does the idea of a working landscape mean to you personally? I already said what it means to me, but how does that reflect your relationship to the land?
So I think a working landscape can take a lot of forms depending on, like I was saying, who you are, where you're coming at it from. For me, it can kind of be threefold. A working landscape is a piece of land that you're engaging with actively to produce or create some end goal. In our case, that is to grow vegetables for our community. Also, at the same time, to be considering and hopefully actively doing some level of conservation on the land, whether it's restoration plantings with some drought-tolerant plantings in mind, like we've done on our farm, or some water-wise projects. And then also to be creating an economic value for those people working on it, and kind of having that give and take so that it can be a sustainable operation, both in the environmental sense, but the financial and human side of it, to be able to continue doing that work. Personally, growing up here, I always had a love of this region and the landscape, and originally that was coming from kind of a recreational side. I did not grow up in a ranching or farming family at all. My family owned a ski shop in town here, so that was where my head was at growing up, but eventually got really curious into ideas of where does our food come from and how can we grow food in a sustainable way for small communities. And so being able to come back to this valley and grow, to, first of all, to be able to acquire a piece of land and begin an intimate relationship with a piece of land, and then work actively to produce a product that is giving back to our community, to conserve it, and to make a livelihood from it is kind of the arc of my view of a working landscape and how we can kind of improve it and create from this piece of land over our tenure there.
You talk about providing food for the community, and Haley, I know you think about this quite a lot. What role do working landscapes play in reconnecting a community to their local food systems, the local food system particularly? And also, like, what role do events like Trailing of the Sheep play in fostering that?
Yeah, this is such a good idea. So one of the things that the working landscape potentially gives you a chance to do is to interact with your food system and the people that produce it in a way that you might not get to see in other types of food. So there's always an ecological piece there. There's always a community piece there, and you really, you'll see folks out. If you come through DuBois, you'll see our herders right beside the highway. And so it starts to put those pieces together for you. But I think that also can be a blessing and a curse, because we're producing food right in, with all these other shared uses. And so we're really accountable in a different way to public opinion. What's really cool about lamb in particular is that it's really accessible, both from the producer side and from a consumer side, and all kinds of different walks of life, all kinds of menus and palates, all kinds of skill. It's actually not that hard to cook. I can do it. So we'll have folks come through the station in the spring. We sell our orphan lambs for $15 or $20, and we'll have 4-H kids come through, and they'll get started, and they're connecting with the food system. Unless you're my mom, she just keeps her bums, and they're getting a little older. But I think it's just, sheep are a pretty accessible way to start to understand agriculture and think about where your food comes from. And festivals like this, it'd be really fun I'm a qualitative researcher. I'd love to interview folks and just find out sort of, what the experience is and what your feedback is, because adults always have good critical questions when they go to something like this. But that's really what it is. The food system isn't just producing protein or producing nutrients. It's the culture and everything from the stewarding of the land through the harvesting and the sharing and the serving, and even the waste. So lamb is a really, really cool portal into that world, as are public lands foods, whether it's, huckleberries. We've had a really good huckleberry year, or elk. So just thinking a little bit about that sustenance and where it comes from is important. And maybe we take it for granted. I think that's probably true when you don't see it in the landscape.
You mentioned public lands, and Mike, I know in your introduction you were talking about running down south into the National Forest in the Humboldt-Toiyabe. Can you help us appreciate the relationship between public and private lands, and how these together help you steward the landscape?
Yeah, and I think the best way to do that is to do a little background first. When you look at a state like the state of Idaho, that's 64% federally owned, and beyond that, by the time you take out farmlands, timberlands, and some of the cities, everything like that, it's a very small percentage that's actually private grazing ground. And so if you're going to run an operation of any size, and I'll use ours for example, we run about 850 mother cows and about 4,000 head of sheep, and then we run our yearling cattle over as well. In the state of Idaho, you're going to run on more than just private ground. You're going to run in a patchwork situation with both Forest Service, BLM, state of Idaho leases, private lands, and it happened for a reason. Back when the Homestead Act came in, you were allowed 160 acres for a farming homestead or 640 acres for a grazing homestead. And when you see some of these grazing homesteads, you think, well, that's not a section of ground, but it actually is. It isn't a square section of ground. They followed the water, they followed the fertile grounds, and they took 40s and 80s and maybe even 160, and it became a very odd shape. And the unwanted lands, if you will, for purposes of homesteading, were those intermittent grounds that ultimately largely became the BLM lands when the BLM was put in place. The Forest Service was in place a lot earlier, back in the early 1900s in our country, and then the BLM came later in the 30s. But so when you move into those areas, obviously, again, like I say, some of those areas are very patchwork. Now, in our lower country, where we start, and these operations are built, and they've been built over a long period of time, and they're built so that the livestock moves with the quality feed. Denny Burks mentioned this afternoon when we had our session over at the library, but we start out in the lower country, in the desert country. We move up from that into the intermediate country as the lower country starts to dry, and then we move ultimately up onto the high country on the forest. And our forest, the highest peak is about 10,800, but we run sheep up to about 9,500 feet for the summer. And then we work our way back down. But beginning, once you start into the intermediate country is when you start coming into this patchwork ground of private BLM and the state leases. And so they've got to work together. And in order to try and improve those working lands, we had to take the stress off of those more productive areas, because that's where the livestock concentrated, obviously, especially early on. And we tried to move them out, and we've used riparian fencing, we've used water being the number one, moving water up onto those uplands, onto those BLM uplands, and in many instances it's private water that's been taken out onto those BLM grounds, and so we can make better utilization of those grounds. And so as you can see, one piece of the puzzle doesn't work without the other, and we have to have all the component parts in order to make an operation that is a year-round, economically viable operation. And that's what we've tried to accomplish in our instance.
The title of this, what is the title of this session? Let me go back. The Future of Conservation in a Crowded West. That word conservation is kind of floating in the background of all of the answers that we're talking about. And Leslie, I don't know of many people that can talk to conservation as well as you can. Can you talk to us about what conservation and maybe a new era of conservation in the West is, and what is the role of working lands in conservation?
Sure. So it's funny. I feel a little bit like a sheep in the headlights here. I'll try to squint too much. Well, just to take us back a little bit, the conservation as we know it today really began basically with this idea that we needed to protect certain places, special places, certain parts of nature from human impacts. And we early on started out with conserving things like Yellowstone National Park. We've got national parks and wilderness areas. And that really sort of became the underlying theme for conservation for a long time. But if you think about the Western landscape, for example, you realize that the places like our national parks tend to be what we call our sort of high peaks and our low deserts. Those were able to be conserved and set aside into things like wilderness areas because they were actually the least populated areas. And there's a reason for that, which is that all the way back through the earliest indigenous days, people have always settled the best pieces of the landscape first, right? We gravitated towards these fertile valley bottoms, places that had rich soils and water and wildlife and good timber, places that were habitable year-round. And that's where human settlement really occurs. And those are the places that over the years got passed down into private ownership. And those that are still intact, that have not become cities and subdivisions, are really mostly our working farms and ranches. And those places that were so habitable for people are also the most important places for wildlife for the very same reasons. And so the remaining working lands and ranches, the last intact pieces of the landscape, are the most important both for people, because it's really our breadbasket, and for wildlife. And so if you're looking for biodiversity, the richest biodiversity per acre, for example, is going to be found there, not up on the highest peaks, not out in the deserts of Canyonlands, which I love, our wilderness areas. I spend a lot of time out there. But if you're looking for the future for wildlife, for nature, biodiversity, for people, for our food production, our fiber, that's going to be in this working land space. And those are the lands that we're losing. That's what we're losing. And when we lose it, we lose our future. And so increasingly, we're beginning to wake up and realize actually the future of conservation is going to have to focus on these working landscapes. But conservation in the context of working lands looks fundamentally different from conservation as we've known it to date with things like wilderness preservation. And that's because when we're trying to protect nature and segregate nature from human impact, you can do things like draw a circle on a map, call it a wilderness, legislate, and regulate. But when you're trying to talk about it in working lands, it's a whole different context, because these are the lands we rely on for our sustenance. This is where we have our livelihoods and our homes and things like that. Instead of trying to separate nature from people, we're actually trying to better integrate people and nature. How do we meet our resource needs and take care of nature? That's what has to happen in the working land space. And so in this context, people are central. Unlike in wilderness, people are central. Relationships matter. Livelihoods matter. We have to be able to have adaptive management so that we can manage for all the different variables in these very complex landscapes, which are living systems. They're dynamic living systems. And economics matter a great deal. And up until now, we've said, well, we don't want to put a price on nature and keep economics out of that picture. But if you don't start valuing conservation and nature in the context of working lands, guess what you lose? And that's what's driving nature off the map. And if you look at the big picture at 50,000 feet of what's shaping the future of the West, it's going to be economics. That's what's driving those decisions. So we need to get to a place in our next era of conservation of thinking about how our economic systems, our cultural systems, our social systems support both our sustenance from these lands and ecological stewardship. So that really is what I mean by the future of conservation. And we need to start to think about the value of human stewardship, what we can actually offer, the way that bees and beavers actually can enrich the land. We have that same capacity, and that's where we need to really focus our efforts. And it's got to be something that we do with the people on the land, not against them. And so when Robert Bonney was celebrating the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone, and he's the Undersecretary of Agriculture for Farm Services and Conservation, he said, we've done important things in conservation, important things in conserving places like Yellowstone National Park. But the future of conservation has got to be about working with, not against people, with, not against agriculture and forestry. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, the economic piece is important, right? Oh, please. The economic piece is so important, right? Without a healthy economic system, those operations go away, and like you said, they get settled in a way that isn't very conservative. Mike and Sarah, as producers, both farm and livestock, how do you balance the economic needs of your business, but with that deep sense of responsibility for the stewardship and health of the landscape? What are the biggest challenges you see in maintaining that balance?
So for us, the economic success of our business and the responsibility to steward the land are intimately tied together, and one can't really go without another. We have a small scale but super high intensity vegetable production where we're selling specialty cash crops at a really high level off of a small piece of land. And so every time we're selling tomatoes at the farmer's market or delivering lettuce to restaurants in the valley, we're actually exporting fertility from our property. We're sending it away from the property as our business model. And in order to ensure the long-term success of our business, we're obligated to then reinvest into our land and our soil. And so we, at any given time, might have 1 acre in vegetables and 2 to 3 in more holistic management that is going to help rebuild and regenerate soil health. So when that rotates back around to vegetable production, we know that it'll keep producing really high quality, nutrient dense vegetables that we can sell here in the community. If we don't reinvest in the health of our property and in the health of our soil, our business will not succeed long term. So it wouldn't be a good business model to not have that reinvestment in the soil. So I can probably go into more of this at a later time, but we're doing cover cropping on the land that's not growing vegetables actively. It's either in cover crop, which is a crop that's grown not as a cash crop, but specifically to put more organic matter back into the soil, rebuild soil health, foster the communities of microbiology, the microbiome of the soil, and then just be worked back in. And then at the same time, we're rotating our sheep flock through super intensively. They're coming through and grazing the cover crop, leaving their manure, and through that digestion process, they're actually increasing the microbiome of the soil too. All of that is in our goal to grow better, healthier, more delicious vegetables. And the taste profile of any vegetable is actually directly tied to the diversity of the soil microbiome. So again, every part of our business and production is intimately tied to fostering the health of our landscape on the farm.
Well, I think Sarah stated it very well. Doesn't matter the size of your operation. Your end goal is largely the same. And that's true of our operation as well. We started out entirely as a sheep business, and then grew into the cattle business, and grew into farming, and then grew into the intensive grazing and those things too. But because of our sheep background, and because of the fact that sheep are probably one of the best animals there are from a standpoint of soil health, because of the type plants they utilize and the type grazing they do, where we graze here today, there tomorrow, and very minimal impact type grazing, and yet help provide good soil health. We incorporated that largely into our cattle side as well, in the fact that we have herders with our cattle. They stay right in the camps. We calve out, other than our first calf heifers that calve in confinement, we calve in the desert. We have calvers right there with the cattle at that time. We have corrals that we can get problem ones into if we need to graft a calf, or if we need to just help one, something like that. But we maintain that situation as we move on up the mountain with these cattle herders. That way we can help distribute the cattle. We can help it helps from a herd health standpoint. It helps to keep the bulls distributed and keep them on point of what they're supposed to be doing instead of fighting with each other. And it just helps from many standpoints. And so as we work down the mountain, that is one of the things. But then we get to that desert that I talked about, where we spend the early part of the year and whatnot. And that used to be country that they went up through with the sheep in about 3 weeks, because there wasn't any water in that country. Very limited spots there was water. And the old water trucks they had, the old 1940s water truck with a 300-gallon tank on it that couldn't pull itself out of a mud hole, it wouldn't water very many sheep. And so it was challenging. And so we as ranchers in that area have put in hundreds of miles of underground water lines, and then tanks and troughs for storage and watering facilities down through that desert. And like I said earlier, a lot of that is private water coming off of private lands and being taken out onto those public lands in order to provide water. And that country is extremely productive country today for our livestock, but it's also extremely productive country for the wildlife. We had very little wildlife in those areas back in those early days, because again, there was no water source, and you've got to have a water source if you're going to have life. And so that's been part of the working lands part of our operation as well. And then we bring it on down to our farm ground, And when I came back to the ranch, as I said, in 1980, my dad had a couple of rules, and one of which was nobody gets asked back. You only come back if you make a conscious decision to do so. 2, after you've worked away for a while. And 3, after you figure out how you're going to make your living, because we ain't splitting mine. And I don't blame him on that one. But so I had an accounting practice that had offices in Beulah and Mountain Home, and I expanded our farming operations. And I was as guilty as the next guy back at that time. I was trying to make a living, and so I was farming very intensively, taking everything I could out of the ground, trying to make as much money as I could to try to make a living. And fortunately, we've been able to move along with that ground, and as I say, we've gone to, instead of taking our cattle to the feedlot to background them, we now run them back out on grass after we wean, and in intensive grazing systems, and we run them back through into the spring and into the summer, ship them weighing anywhere from 900 to 1,000 pounds off of grass to be finished. And we do that, again, much like Sarah, in an intensive grazing fashion. We interseed with cover crops into our alfalfas and our grassland fields. And we've turned all of our pivots back into the grazing and haying. We've tripled our production with under these pivots, being able to bring water back quickly, which is what grass wants. It doesn't want a lot of water and then not see it again for a long time. It wants a little bit of water often. So being able to triple the numbers on that ground and still work towards these soil health solutions that this provides has been a big part of the newest challenge on our operation.
Haley, Leslie, what role does community play in working lands conservation? And we've talked about community quite a bit. And that's whether it's family, you talked about your mom not getting rid of anything, neighbors, scientists, you're a scientist yourself, policymakers, or even just the passionate public. What role do they play when it comes to managing the land and keeping it healthy?
So you asked the social scientist, so I'll try to keep it brief, I guess. So one thing to think about with rangelands, which are what you see here on the slideshow, is that this is a global community. So we often get raised a little bit in our presentations. Every rangeland science talk starts with rangelands cover 40 to 60% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. Ha ha ha. But if you've driven through the United States, you know it's all that boring stuff that you're falling asleep on, right? We think rangelands support about 600 million households. They're really important to about 1 billion people. They're pretty important to about 2 billion people. Sheep were domesticated on basically sagebrush about 13,000 years ago. So they're a very old part of who we are as humans, and they're a very old part of how we think about living on the landscape. And they're really important to our future because they're very low input production systems, and they're really high protein from landscapes that it's hard to eat unless it goes through a rumen. They're also very important to women. So in places where women cannot own land, they can own sheep and goats, and they can milk, and they can get fiber, and they can get meat from those animals and have really vitally important relationships with them. In the academic literature, we have a lot of research looking at the role of communities in shaping the norms and institutions that support sustainable, and I say that I mean long-term, sustainable, long-term management of natural resource systems. And we have a ton of economics and ethnography to counter this idea of the tragedy of the commons. Sure, you'll see it. Sure, people will exploit common pool resources, but communities all over the world can manage their own common pool resources with norms and institutions that are set up to do so. And they'll even share resources for the neighboring community. So it's kind of like a spare bedroom. I go over to Jared's house, he's got somewhere for me to crash. Pastoralists in Mongolia will do that for one another, and they'll share pasture. Community is also really important in ranching communities in the West in terms of pooling and sharing resources, knowledge, genetics, human and livestock genetics and crop genetics, spiritual communities, in getting people into agriculture and keeping them in the community, and also just helping folks deal with extreme events like fires, a hay fire or a drought. There are folks there to back you up. So community is really important. And when we talk to ranchers in our ethnography and we talk to them about what makes you climate resilient, how are you going to adapt to these changing conditions, community changes are actually a big concern. They have a lot of tools to deal with drought or water availability, but they don't have a lot of tools to deal with these big changes in the community that they're seeing in terms of amenities. So hospitals, how far do you have to drive to get to the hardware store? Is there a community for your kids to come back to that they want to be a part of? So that's a challenge. And then the last thing I think is that ranchers are showing us, I've been mentored. I thought I had a PhD in collaboration. No, I came to the sheep station and I got schooled. A couple of wonderful ranchers sat me down and said, get off your island, on your little science island, and go out there and pay attention to what's happening. People are collaborating. That is our tradition here in this part of the world. And it doesn't matter if it's a brand new range specialist at the Forest Service or someone that really deeply cares about grizzly bears that has no idea which way is north, or someone in a different community that you've never talked to. You've got to work with everyone. You've got to bring them in. And so ranchers really know how to do that. And I just wrote a paper saying we should listen to how they're doing this. It's working at a scale that's actionable spatially and temporally. So you can't decide who's in your community. You can't exclude anybody. You've got to listen to all of them. And so on Monday, I was hiking with an environmental law firm that sued us a couple times, and we're putting out camera traps and we're trying it. I guess, trust is still low, but the data don't lie, so we'll see where it goes. So that's kind of where I think about it. Those are the jobs that community does to support working lands and conservation. But communities can't do those jobs in our landscapes if there's high levels of conflict, wealth inequality, challenges getting basic human amenities, access to land is really tough, whether that's land prices or access to Forest Service permits. And communities can't do that if we don't have a willingness to contribute. We all have to give something up to collaborate. You really have to give up your staunch little eddy you're swirling in to come down and flow downstream with us. So this is not a joke. Will Munger, our postdoc, is up there, and I said, I can only say peer-reviewed things at this panel, but this is not a peer-reviewed comment. This is a local knowledge Du Bois, Idaho comment. When you move to Du Bois, they don't ask you where you're from. They don't ask you how long you've been there. They say, what are you going to contribute to our community? And that's lovely, because that's a place we can all start from. So I think that's what community means in this space.
Leslie, I want to ask a kind of slightly different question that was not in our pre-planned questions. But I know because of your work that you can speak to this, and it got kind of brought up in this in Haley's answer that community change is really difficult, right? The title also has Crowded West of this panel, right? We are getting a lot more people moving here, and people that love the area but maybe don't understand how these landscapes work, and that's fine. We're all learning together. But we often hear in the popular discourse about challenges of livestock, right? Cow burps, cow farts, wolves, overgrazing, right? This is real. This is part of the discourse. Can you respond to all of that? Like, why should we believe any of this? Why should we believe, after all of this, that livestock, sheep, or cattle are good on these lands?
Wow. Okay, let's see.
Sorry. In a few minutes.
Actually, I think it's a really great question. I think it's an important one. I think many of us ask it, all the time. I think the fact that it go back in our history for a long ways is part of the answer. The fact that it supports so much of the world's population is part of the answer. The fact that many of our rangelands co-evolved with grazing animals is a very big part of the answer. And one of the things that I was out on a couple of field tours last year with some soil health scientists, and we're studying some different systems. And both of these we went on to BLM allotments, and these are some fairly arid allotments. And in both cases, we got to see a BLM allotment that had been rested for a very long time next to an allotment section that was very actively managed by good practitioners. And in both cases, it was as clear as day to anybody that was standing there. The land that had been rested for a long time was in much worse condition than the land that had been actively managed with livestock. When you dug up the clumps of grass on the ungrazed side, the rested side, in one case had been rested, I think, 14 years. And this was fence line comparison, same soil type, same vegetation type, no difference except the management on the two sides of the fence. You pull up the grass clump on the rested side, and it was weak. It wasn't a vigorous root. The plant didn't show a lot of great vigor. The soil wasn't rich. On the side that had been grazed, you had this incredibly rich, hefty root system, vigorous plant, and the soil looked much, much better. On another one that had been rested for a long time, you saw enormous amount of soil erosion in the area that had been rested, the pedestaling of the plants and so forth. So the idea that grazing is always bad for the land is not founded. In some cases it's true, and in many cases it's absolutely not true. And so the question about do livestock belong is really more about, it depends, for one thing. It's more about the how than the cow, is a saying that we often do. It's how they're managed. It's how they're stocked. It's what the piece of ground is. It's what the history of this piece of ground is. It's what the larger need in the landscape is. It's what the other animals on the lands are. It's what climate and weather are doing at that time. So again, these are very complex living systems, and grazing plays actually quite an important role and has for eons around the world. So I think that our task is to learn how to do it better and better and better. And Aldo Leopold once said that the oldest task in human history was to learn how to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. So on a very crowded planet, our job is to figure out how to live on planet Earth without spoiling it, how to get our food, how to turn sunlight into protein on lands that otherwise we can't farm and grow our own food on. This is our challenge, and we're not going to get it perfect every time. And so we've got to give each other some grace. We've got to learn together instead of fighting with each other. And I think, that's how you move forward with that kind of question. I guess that's a long answer to a tough question, but we're figuring it out. And yeah, we learn.
Props for rising to that challenge. That was a tough question.
Oh, and can I just say one last thing?
Please do.
We need better science. We need better science about climate and beef and methane and all those things that we hear. A lot of our science is either, you hear it through an agenda filter. And when you sort it out, there's apples and oranges and all kinds of stuff. So we have always got the question in our organization about, what is the best science out there? How can we get better science? And we need science to be developed with practitioners on the ground in real world conditions, and it needs to be apples and apples. So when you hear the science that gets kicked around in some of our dialogue today, public dialogue that's so polarized, be thoughtful about it. Ask hard questions about what you're hearing in the media and other places.
Yeah, thank you. You guys are very kind to our panelists. I love this. I want us to be able to, sooner rather than later, turn over to Q&A, because I think there's a lot of stuff that we've already talked about, and I want to remind you all to start thinking about the questions that you want to ask our panelists. They've probably got somewhere in the realm of, 100 years worth of experience between, take Mike out, maybe 30. Yeah, a little bit. So I want you to start thinking about questions, but I do want to turn it over to Q&A sooner rather than later. So I'm going to just skip right to the end here, and I don't want you guys to skimp on time. What gives you hope when you think about the future of working landscapes here in the West? Especially as you think about the next generation of land stewards, the younger people in our audience particularly, and as the ongoing as the ongoing pressures on land use grow, right? As we were talking about with development and such. What is the legacy you guys hope to leave behind? Anyone can start.
Well, I guess since I pawned off the start on the beginning, I better start here. I think when I think about it, I don't know that it's one thing that doesn't change from generation to generation in agriculture is that we have a humanitarian responsibility to feed the world and take care of the people of this world. And that will continue on. But it will continue on, and it will become more and more difficult because of some of the things that have been mentioned by Leslie and the rest of this panel, some of the challenges that are going to come with it. And so when I look to these next generations, Leslie's point about the fact that we need more science, we need better science on climate control, a lot of these different areas that are starting to impact things. You know, we're going through a pretty significant drought this year and whatnot, and it's going to start to have impacts on some of our production, those kind of things. So, you know, I think it's going to be extremely important that these younger people get involved and bring different thoughts and processes and yeah, you can make the statement that there's nothing new in the world. I've been on a lot of different range tours when somebody came out and said, yeah, we're doing this research, first time it's ever been done. Actually, I'd been on 3 previous range tours that had all done studies on it. They were on a shelf somewhere, but nobody knew where they were anymore. But so maybe part of it is just accumulating that information and getting it back out to a place where it's viable. But when I've had opportunities to speak to some of these younger groups, one of the things I've told them is, you know, when I was very involved in the National Public Lands Council, and we worked back in Washington, D.C. and for the industry, and we did a deal called WLPA, Western Livestock Producers Alliance, where we spent $3 million and a lot of manpower hours over 3 years in 3 cities in the East. And we were able to change the articles from 2-to-1 against us to 2-to-1 in our favor. And that was a great thing. But we did it in 3 cities in an entire country. And it cost a lot of money and a lot of time. But as I've told these young people, you have an opportunity here. If you can become the credible source with what's available in social media to touch so many people with so much less effort, that if that opportunity isn't taken, we will have really missed the boat. We have to get to the people in a session like this, you know, whatever those sessions may be, but so many people are tied to social media, not myself so much, but because I'm the long part of that part you were talking about. But, you know, that I think is the challenge to these young people. Become the credible source, get the information out there, let's work together, let's come up with the solutions.
I would say what inspires and motivates me most in our work is just the incredible support of the community for local food and for a local food community here in the Wood River Valley. That feedback that we get on the work we're doing and the food we're growing is definitely what keeps me going. And I think that there's so much room for more, not just here in our community, but throughout the country, throughout the world, for small scale growers to grow a lot of food and work within their communities, within their networks, to provide truly more resilient local food communities. And we always are begging for more farmers. We just need more farmers. And I think that there is hope in younger generations in interest in topics of sustainability and conservation. All of you chose to be here tonight to learn about this. So there's more, it seems like, more interest and motivation to get involved in these areas. And I would just, you know, no scale is too small or too big. We manage 13 acres. We grow vegetables on about 3 of those on any given time, and we crank out a lot of food. So if there were more farms at our scale, a little smaller, a little bigger, along with the much larger operations that are more typical in southern Idaho and the West, there is a huge potential for growing food for humans. as Mike was saying, we have this moral obligation to grow food for humans, and it can be done in a way that is not ruining our planet, and is even potentially improving the land that we're using to grow that food. So that's my hope.
I can't add much to that. That was really well said. Yeah, hope is a will and a way. So I think for me, I get really excited just to bring students in or bring interns in and other nerds and start to think about these problems and to keep learning, because it's always changing. Another thing that my dad taught me, he learned this from Nelson Starkweather, who was a rancher in Gardner, Montana, that ranching's the art of mothering up. So you're always trying to, sort of foster the next generation, and you're creating habitat where everybody can thrive and be their own best self. And I'm trying to run my science lab that way a little bit, and think like a rancher, think like a pastoralist, not necessarily like a farmer. So we've got to be adaptive, we've got to be mobile, we've got to be connected, we've got to be diverse, we've got to find ways towards peace, reduction of violence, and we've got to let all these different critters be themselves and decide sort of how they can best be themselves. So I think we're learning from the ranchers, from the herders, how to do that. I think science has forgotten it in some cases. Not everything is a small plot study or a p-value. Sometimes it's a meal or an art event or a song by the campfire. So that component of it feeds into the engineering and the models, and I think if we forget that, then what's the point? So I've been really lucky to be part of this sheep story. Boy, sheep folks are weird, They're weird. They're just a little bit different. I worked with cattle producers for a long time, and I love them, but they'd call me and they'd complain for half an hour before I could get to the story. And sheep producers call me with hypotheses and data and ideas for projects, so it's kind of cool. But they're just real flexible and sort of under the radar, because Mike's up on stage telling the story for him. But I think there's a lot of good things happening, and we should take the criticisms and the questions, because those are research questions and they're important, and we can work together to solve those problems if we listen hard enough. So.
Well, this whole thing, I think, is about stories, and I think that the thing that gives me hope is that I get to be part of and see a story in my daily work that so many people, unfortunately, don't get to see. My other friends that don't work in this field wake up every day and they read the news online or watch the television, see the newspapers, and what do we have? We have violence, we have war, we have polarization, we have craziness and tragedy, and it's pretty depressing. A lot of my friends, young and old, kids, teenagers, all the way up, talk about how depressing it is actually today and how hopeless that they feel. But I get to go out in places where there's a different story happening. It's a story that doesn't get covered in our news. It's the great untold story, in my opinion. It's of tremendously good people doing tremendously good things on landscapes all over the place, working together, collaborating across partisan lines, setting that aside, trying to do good for land, good for wildlife, and good for people. There are hundreds of place-based collaborative conservation organizations out there across the West. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of landowners representing tens of millions of acres across the West that are 100% dedicated to leaving the world a better place than they found it. And you should see the things that they're doing. And they're doing it together, doing it across fence lines with their communities. And it's incredibly exciting. And to be with people who mean well, act well, see a bigger vision of the future, that to me is the great untold story. And I recently asked a fairly prominent journalist who's doing a lot of coverage of environmental work that's happening outside of, say, national parks, things like that. They're doing coverage of things that are happening in urban areas, things that are happening on tribal lands. And I said, could we get some stories of the amazing things that are happening on private lands and ranches? And she said, I'm sorry, but that's a really tough sell. People just don't really want to hear that. And we've heard editors of, films and things say, you know, there's not any controversy in it. We need controversy. Controversy is what sells. And so you don't get the great untold story, but it's out there. It's under our noses, and it's something we can all participate in. And what really makes me excited is when young people apply to our organization to work, they often tell me, you know, I really want to work with you guys. I want to work for a future that does work with people, not against people, that's engaged in positive things, positive outcomes on the land. They see a different future for how we can work together, very much like Mike said, and they're excited and they want to be part of it. And I think that's really the great hope, and certainly that's what keeps me going every single day.
Thank you all for sharing your stories with us tonight. For me, I hope you've inspired us to think about how we, in our own busy lives, can help our conservation efforts. And what I mean by help is to listen to our working landscape communities, show up to help get the work done, and support these efforts that are paving the way for healthy landscapes and healthy communities. And I know we get caught up in the day-to-day and the conflicting messages that we often hear. But I urge you to find those big thinkers that are working to steward our landscapes and see what you can do to support them. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French scholar who in 1835 published a book called Democracy in America. He traveled all around America exploring what made our democracy so great. And one thing he said always sticks out to me. He exalted our communities, but he also had a warning. He didn't think our democracy had really been tested, not like Europe's communities had been for a millennia. He thought that because we could always leave when things got tough, since we had so much space in our country, that we hadn't figured out how to really have the crucial conversations that would be required when we could no longer leave. We are now a bit more crowded, and now we can't quite, live like we used to. It's time to figure out how to have these conversations and support each other in our efforts to steward and care for our landscapes and communities. Lastly, I want to leave off with a quote by Wallace Stegner. Wallace Stegner was an author and a scholar and a big thinker here in the West. And I think to wrap this up, it's kind of the perfect quote. One cannot be pessimistic about the West. This is the native home of hope. And when it fully learns that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the quality that most characterizes and preserves it, then it will have achieved itself and outlived its origins. Then it has a chance to create a society to match its scenery. Thank you, guys. Okay, we would like to open it up to Q&A. Please just raise your hand. Either Bree or Lane will come to you. Because we were going to do note cards and we're not, we're just kind of doing a play here real quick. We want to make sure there are questions instead of just comments, guys, just questions. So we'll start here.
Okay. You talked about collaboration, which I think is critical, but it seems to me that the major threat to that is probably not between environmentalists and traditional land users, but between producers like yourselves and the giant industrial farming and probably ranching that is killing small businesses, small towns by creating these giant farms. Don't need people if you have lots of tractors. So how do you see that as a threat to the Western landscape?
Definitely it's a concern. We've seen it a lot in our specific area, if you will, some of these large corporate operations. And we've seen some of it just in natural changes in time. Early on in our area, people farmed 80 acres, maybe 120, 160 acres. They had livestock on the land with it. When I look at what we're doing now with the intensive grazing and whatnot, we're really only going back to where we were. Those kind of things. But because of the economics, especially on the farming side, because of the economics and the cost of the equipment and those kind of things, they were forced to go to larger and larger operations in order to be economically viable. And what that did in many, many small communities is as it automated, it did away with hired men. I mean, I can remember back, every operation, even if it only had 120 acres, had a hired man. And So that was families, additional families to your schools. That was additional families buying in downtown America, which is, as we all know, drying up and blowing away in these small towns. And some of that I don't know the answer to. It's just economics, and we're not going to get around some of that. The other side of it, when we start talking about the large corporate entities, that's another one that's difficult. This country was built by a lot of those type entrepreneurs in many ways. But now we're starting to see large investment funds starting to come in and buy up some of these lands and tie up some of these lands. And they don't have the same interest. They just want a rate of return. They have an exact rate of return. Maybe it's a 5% rate of return that they want off of these lands. And you figure out how to get it there. We just demand that you get it there. And that one does concern me. The concern of tying up a lot of lands and excluding the public from a lot of those lands, as we're seeing in many instances too. That one's a concern too. One of the things I think I'm most proud of is the fact that my grandfather, nor my father, nor myself has ever posted an acre of ground on our operation. We want our friends to come and enjoy it like we do. We just ask that they respect it like we do. And by the way, if they wouldn't mind going ahead and taking their trash back home with them, that would be appreciated too. I'm always amazed by the fact that they're strong enough to carry those cases of beer in, but the tin cans are too heavy to carry out. But probably a poor answer to your question. I haven't answered it for sure, but these are issues that are going to have to be dealt with in how do we continue to keep these landscapes productive, and how do we go back to what we were talking about the humanitarian responsibility of providing food and fiber for the world. And that's going to be a tough challenge. It's going to be a tough challenge for the young people that come.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that, and it's a huge and scary question, so I'm just gonna touch the surface. But it's really complicated. Our entire food system has been built around producing food in a way that actually isn't economically viable and doesn't actually directly feed humans. And I do not know how to tackle that, other than to say that small-scale farming actually is viable. I don't have proof of this, but I would argue that our farm, which is 7 acres, is probably one of the most profitable farms per acre in the county. Now, is our style of farming scalable? Can we do what we're doing on 20, 50, 100,000 acres? No, and that's why people don't do it. But can there be 10, 100, however many farms that are similar or complementary to ours that produce food for a community directly? Yes, that's possible. There's the question of access to land and real estate, and that's a whole nother thing I'm not gonna touch at all. But there are ways to combat it, and I would just say, think about where your food's coming from. Vote with your fork. It's often not more expensive to buy regionally produced food than it is to buy whatever is on the shelf in the grocery store. And so just think critically about it, and think about how you can subvert in a little way with each meal the system that's been created, and kind of start support again for a more regionally based food system. In Idaho, we do produce a lot of diverse types of food that would fill out a plate, fill out a pretty wholesome diet. And I think, we can just start to think about those things as a way to combat the system and the problems you're asking about on an individual scale, and hope that those individual efforts amount to a bigger change.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question that arose during the discussion about community, and I think Jared phrased his question really well. I believe he used the words passionate public. How do you recommend, I think actually Mike did, give us a little bit of a recommendation for us younger folks to engage with our social networks, but how do you recommend that we engage those who are disengaged with the food system or maybe have never even been exposed to working lands?
Well, I'll just say that is a question that we deal with every single day in our work. It's just one of the biggest challenges out there. We have less than 2% of the population today involved in agriculture in this country. And it's not only are we losing our working lands, we're losing the people that actually know how to manage them and care to manage them and don't mind living out in rural areas and doing that kind of work. So we're really losing that piece of the population. And how do you get folks from cities to come out? You know, a lot of our folks are doing tours with, you know, all kinds of different student groups and community groups, but it's really such a tiny drop in the bucket, really, of telling those stories. So, you know, we're doing everything we can through social media, through, we've got a film event happening here in Oregon next week, doing a lot of outreach, a lot of storytelling. We've got a magazine, we've got podcasts, we've got films. So we're trying to invite the public in to understand it from there, but it's really hard unless you've actually been out there to do it. So I think it is one of the great challenges that we have today. I'd love to see our educational system do more with agriculture. We have a lot of environmental studies, and a lot of those environmental study courses are pretty skewed. And it would be really nice if we wove in a little more of the complexity of what's happening on the agricultural side and in land in general. Maybe that would be a bit of a start. I don't really have a great answer to you except to say I think it's one of the biggest, most profound challenges we have today.
Leslie, as an environmental studies professor, I love that answer. Absolutely love that. Thank you. I will actually pop in here really quick. One of the ways that I've seen happen such great results is young people going to the farmers market and talking to the farmers, asking them questions and saying, "Can I come out?" And guess what? No one ever says no. They're so excited to share their knowledge and their land and their own passion. Anyone else want to answer on that? Do we have any other questions? I'm not, maybe there in the back? Yeah.
Last year at the Cowboy Poetry Gathering down in Elko, Jeff Mundell talked about the importance of publicly herding livestock to reconnect people with that food system. And in 2026, we have the International Year of the Rangelands and Pastoralists. And I guess I want to ask the panelists, how do we scale from the trailing of the sheep here in the Big Wood River Valley to international solidarity with pastoralists across the world who are facing similar challenges? How do we, we've talked about these scales all night, but, what's kind of the big picture on a global level, how we scale up that sort of transforming of our food systems and these relationships that you've been talking about?
Boy, these are great questions. You guys are an amazing audience. So that's, again, a question we think about a whole lot, and we're thinking about that year of pastoralism as well. I love this festival, Old Salt. I don't know if you all have been to that. That's a new one that's started happening over in Helmsville, Montana. It's been fantastic. It's drawn a couple thousand people. I hope they can keep going. I think bringing together community food, agriculture, land stewardship in beautiful settings and with great entertainment and music and fun. We have to put the fun back in life again. And so I think that's a big part of it and the celebration. And I do think that we're getting another cause for optimism is that a number of our environmental organizations have begun to really see the importance of working lands and of supporting people on these landscapes. And I think they kind of have a bullhorn to the world. They tell a lot of the urban public how to think about these things. And we're seeing a shift there that is actually quite encouraging. So I think part of scaling up is reaching out to those groups that have a big influence over lots of people out there. And that should be sportsmen's groups and environmental groups and so forth. The health industry, we're seeing more and more sort of the connection between food and human health, right? And so getting our healthcare system involved in these celebrations and this messaging is another way I think we can scale up somewhat.
Yeah, I think that's good, and I think what we're seeing a lot to what you're talking about out there too. You know, we're not just seeing it in this country; we're seeing it worldwide. Some of the issues that we're dealing with. You look at a lot of the European countries, and a lot of the fights the farmers are fighting over there, and for a lot of the same issues and everything. But I think maybe potentially some, you know, intercontinental work, if you will, is important in this too. I had an opportunity back many years ago in '99 to represent the U.S. sheep industry at the World Meat Congress in Ireland, and I made some friends from around the world in the same basically industry as myself. And one fellow was from France, in the sheep business from France, and we talked about a lot of their issues and got to be good friends. And he came over a year later for the WTO meetings in Seattle, and he flew down for a couple of days to spend a couple of days with me and kind of see how our operation was. And we were headed out from the lower ranch up to the upper ranch, and he was quite a chatty fellow, and he was talking along, and suddenly he started getting a little quieter and finally I looked over at him. He was a little pale, and I said, "Are you all right?" And he goes, "Yeah, but if something happens to us out here, will anybody ever find us?" And you have to realize, you know, a lot of country for him was, you know, I'm sure it was in kilometers, but 3 or 4 kilometers to the next town. You know, he couldn't understand the vastness of what we deal with in some of these pastoral lands, and other countries do too. And so I think not only is it incumbent upon us to be able to further our understanding in this country, but we need to do it internationally as well, to see the challenges that we're all dealing with.
And if you all have any celebrity contacts, I would be happy to talk to them.
I hear Taylor Swift does pretty good. I think, yeah, please.
Sorry about that. I grew up in California, but I've lived in the East for most of my life. And one of the questions that you've been talking about is the scale of everything out here in the West. And, you know, in the East, things are, you know, it's all been settled for hundreds of years, and there's not a lot of choices about what you can do anymore. And looking at the choices that we have available because of the scale we have here, what do you think is the most significant way to best use the scale that we have? I mean, it's something in the East, we don't have enough room to do that. There is enough room for this, and we have room here, but how do we best use the room we have? And I have a little a kind of question behind that is water is obviously such a critical element to all of this. None of this will work if we can't somehow figure out how to best use the water we have, get it to where we need, maybe via pipes or what have you, or decide, you know, when it doesn't make sense to try and make the desert, you know, into greenery or what have you. So it's really the scale and water, how those things work together. Thank you.
Well, you know, you hit on a real tough challenge, and we're seeing it in all the urban areas of the West, largely. And Idaho's a classic example. A year ago, we were the fastest growing state in the nation with the movement of people, many from the California area to Idaho, for those very reasons you're talking about, the open spaces, what's available to them. But the problem that we've seen is, and I'll just use Twin Falls for an example. Boise's a better example, but Twin is too. We are covering up farm ground left and right with concrete and pavement and houses. And this isn't poor farm ground. This is some of the finest farm ground we've got. And somehow we have got to get in control of that. And then the other issue is what you brought up, and the other limiting factor, and that's water. This is an arid lands in the western United States, and water is a very precious resource. And we hadn't adjudicated our water until the 1990s in the state of Idaho, and we adjudicated everything except domestic wells. Domestic wells were still allowed to be punched left and right. Well, that wasn't a big issue in the 90s because we weren't experiencing all this growth. Well, guess what? Now it is. And now we've over adjudicated the aquifer, and we're trying to figure out how to get more water back into the aquifer to just sustain what we're existingly doing and not even looking yet at the growth. We've got to figure that one out too. So, you know, your point, how do we store more water? How do we store it above ground? How do we store it in the aquifer? That is going to be key in the West to whatever we're going to be able to develop. Then from there, since this thing is based on, again, you know, how do we preserve these working lands and the what they produce? We're going to have to start making some conscious decisions on where we allow some of this to happen, and that's hard to do because, you know, in our society, if I want to sell that piece of ground to a developer, I can sell that piece of ground to a developer. But I think part of what you're seeing too, from that standpoint, you're seeing much more of, and it's been brought on largely because of carbon sequestration and carbon credits and some of those things, but are the conservation easements in many places and whatnot that are going to try and limit the development. We've had efforts made in our area already, and it's because of these same concerns. And so I guess that's one attempt at answering it, and I'll let some of the others.
Well, we've got a question up here. Let's go to, yeah.
Yeah, when you talk to producers, be they ranchers, be they farmers, whether they're in Iowa or Idaho, I think something that comes through is that it's a damn hard business, right? And my question is, in a world where an iPhone app can make 20 million bucks, but somebody that's working their ass off raising sheep is struggling to be profitable, how do we get here, and how do we get to a place that's better?
Good question.
Yeah, you know, I'll give one little thing. I did just for curiosity. I started looking online to see what does the average person in the United States spend on various different things. So you look at cosmetics, streaming like Netflix, soda pop, beer, things like that, and I put a little bar chart together, and it's way up here. We spend a lot on those things. You get down to talking about anything to do with conservation, it almost doesn't even show up on the bar chart. We spend less than, oh gosh, maybe 1 or 2 beers worth, not even a 6-pack, per person, per taxpayer in the United States to support, for example, threatened and endangered species, right? So somehow we have to align, again, you know, what our economics with what we want to see out on the landscape. And I think it's really hard when people don't see the immediate effects. You know, you can go buy a 6-pack and you've got something immediate in your hand. You know, I have this image in my mind I've shared sometimes, which is like, okay, you go down on Saturday morning to the farmer's market and you got the booth that's selling some vegetables, and you got the one that's selling meat and then cheeses maybe and dried flowers, and then you've got this poor guy down at the end who's got a little postcard, and he's selling wildlife habitat stewardship. And if you want to know where like the shortest line is that morning, you probably go to that booth, right? Because it's not something you can just grab and take home with you. It requires some foresight, I think, on our parts, and I think that's one of the hardest things. But we've got to have society as a whole contribute to the health of these lands, to the food systems that we need, to healthy food, and it's going to be some combination of public and private partnership. Government is going to have a role in this. So does industry, but so do we as consumers. So I think part of it is bringing awareness to that issue. But if we're not willing to pay the real cost of food production and environmental stewardship, we're going to end up on the direction that we're going.
Yeah, I'll just tack onto that. Again, our food system, the modern big ag in our country and in many parts of the world at this point is so complicated and has created all these subsidies and this really convoluted system to the point that the average consumer has no idea the real cost it takes to produce food, and you know what it actually costs to get that food to their plate, all the different steps. And so I don't have a good answer to this, but to somehow re-educate and kind of take the veil away from what that system really entails and the true cost of producing food, I think could maybe recalibrate some of what you're asking about. Like, how do we revalue food production for human beings to consume, for local communities to consume, and then have more of a direct understanding, direct connection to the work that it takes to produce that food.
Okay, down here in the corner. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been such a rich evening of so much thought. I am so glad I came. And the question I have may not have an answer tonight, but I think I really have to ask it. This is an election season, of course, and we have heard very little about how climate is affecting our economy, and how our shared landscape is being managed or used or abused. And I am thinking that we may want to ask the question of how to shift from an economy that's based on unlimited growth. You know, when you talk about farmland, ranchland, developers, growth pressures, we're seeing it in our valley here big time. And how to shift that perspective of an economy based on growth, unlimited growth, to one based on a sustainable, environmentally healthy economy. And I think about, when I ask this question, I'm thinking about an article I read a little while ago about the Columbia Basin Native Americans, stories about what they call the original laws. And the original laws were what they learned 12,000 years ago, or whenever they first came across the Beringia Bridge and entered a new landscape and didn't know really how to go forward. And the stories that came out of that were that they watched, they observed the landscapes, the animals, the wildlife, the plant life, and they learned from that. They learned from the biological world how to go forward. And I think about, we've had people on this continent for 12,000 at least years, and now, as white colonial settlers, we came in 200 years ago or more, and what we have, our attitude and perspective has changed and affected the landscape. And how do we go forward with climate as a driving force in how we manage the land and ourselves? That's a big question.
That is a big question, yeah.
But there's this shift that I'm...
Would just one of you guys ask like a simple question
Yeah.
tonight?
What's your middle name? I actually think I'm going to maybe jump in on that one. That is actually part of my research quite a bit. We have built a society where we do not live within the rhythms and the ebbs and the flows of our natural systems. I'm there in Boise. There is not a day of the year that I can't eat a lobster dinner at any time of the day. Winco is open 24 hours. I could go down there at 2 in the morning and I could get lobster. Right? That's a problem, right? We wear really, really nice coats to keep us really warm outside. We're using our technology to live outside of the ebbs and flows of the natural system. We are no longer held responsible to our natural systems. you're talking about big social change, and if we want to do that, we have to take seriously that if we want to understand, respect, and experience our natural systems, we have to live responsibly within them, and what that means is be accountable to them. And we don't do that very well, at least. So it's a big question. I'm going to maybe move on just a little bit, and then we'll.
Yeah, some of our agriculture is still more tied probably than other pieces. But that was a really affirming question. I'm glad I'm not going crazy and you notice these things too. So when I talk to producers about climate or extreme events, they talk about big shifts, big transitions in agriculture that are probably technologically advanced, but that might be more environmentally adapted to the environment. So, for example, can sheep overwinter on winter range without needing supplementary alfalfa for longer periods of time? That's a climate adaptation. But we need whole systems to work that way. We need genetics and herders that know how to do that. So, yeah, I think it's probably not as terrifying for producers that live with it all the time, and they're sort of used to dealing with weather stress from my interviews with folks in that realm. And so it can actually cause another rift where they're like, what are you freaking out about? We deal with this all the time, and we deal with stacked events, fire and bears and blizzards and things. So that's something we're thinking about. And then, yeah, Mike, do you have a thought on that?
Well, I guess just to take off of that a little bit, yeah, we do. We deal with extreme events. With anytime you deal with Mother Nature, and you know, when I was young, I always thought I could outsmart Mother Nature, and she hit me upside the head pretty hard a few times, and I realized she was actually in charge. And so, you know, we've made some changes too based on what we've seen. You know, I can remember also when I was a young man back in the operation with my father, and you know, always all the time saying to him, God, I wish it would rain. I wish we could get some rain. I wish we could have some rain and whatnot. And he'd look at me and go, you know, we live in a desert, right? And that's right, we do. And so we have to learn to adapt to that, and we have to learn to adapt to what that resource provides. In our own operation, I think we were kind of, we're Basque, and so we don't have any problem running our head into the wall 3 or 4 times before we decide it hurts. But you know, we were calving in the winter months out when it was very extreme conditions, and we were watching Mother Nature fawn in the spring months when things worked very well and we didn't fight. She wasn't fighting all the weather issues and those kind of things. So we started thinking, well, maybe there's something to that. And so we've made some changes that way as well. And so, you know, I think part of it is being adaptable. You know, we can argue all night over whether over global warming, climate change, everything. I believe in climate change. We've had climate change from the beginning of time. I remember when I was in school, we were going to be going back to the ice ages. Now, I haven't been around for the whole 200 years, just close to it. But so we've had changes, and we have to be adaptable, and we've always had to be adaptable in agriculture. And I think you'll see that we can still do that. We've got to figure out how, in some instances, to make the conservation work and make that happen. But you know, that's just been part of life, and that's just been part of the challenges of our operations, is to be able to deal with the droughts versus, you know, some of the toughest years. Henry will tell you too. You know, those wet years when you think you got an abundance of feed out there and you think you're going to have the very best lambs you ever had and whatnot. They turn out so washy, they don't weigh, and those kind of, you know, we've learned a lot of things from Mother Nature, and we've learned to adapt and kind of stay to work within her realms. And I think that's just what we're going to have to continue to do to deal with some of the issues that you're talking about.
Well, I'd love to jump in just really quick. You know, such a great question, such an important question, and such a hard one. And I don't think we have answers to so many of these different things, but in my work, one thing I've learned is these are human caused. I mean, these are people problems generally that we're talking about, and it will take people working together to solve them. There's really no other way. We either can fight and go to war and tear each other to pieces and the planet with it, as we're seeing in parts of the world right now, or we can rise to our highest and best selves. And humans have only survived on this planet by cooperating. We're like this naked, defenseless beast, without, not even a beast, without our ability to cooperate, we would have never survived. But our ability to cooperate depends on the quality of the relationships we have with one another, in our community, with our families. And we've got this incredibly polarized world right now, and fear drives us more apart. It drives us into hostilities. We've got to resist the fear-based place and the anger. And there was once a therapist I heard that said, you know, anger is actually a secondary emotion. He said, if you imagine it as a big red balloon and there's a knot at the bottom of the balloon, and he said, you follow that string down, it will inevitably lead to a more primary emotion, something like grief or sadness or fear. And I think we need to take a hard look at that when we see all the anger that we have in the world, which I encounter in my daily work all the time. Sportsmen, landowners, ranchers, angry at each other. And I often wonder, if we trace that string down, do we come to a place of common grief at what we're losing, for example, the land that we care about, or fear as to what's ahead of us? And that fear-mongering in our media and our political world out there is making things worse by the day. So I think that what I would say is that we each have an opportunity in our own lives to think about the quality of our relationships with our neighbors, with our families, in local communities, and to reject those that would drive us into those places of fear and anger, and to not fund those organizations that try to other people, that try to turn people into enemies against one another. You know, when you call even, you know, the ag industry, oh, the industry is doing something bad. You take the faces off of the people, you put it into this, you dehumanize it so that you can throw a lot of hatred at it. And I think we have to reject that in our world. So that's just one place, I think, as individual people, we can start and help our children do that as well. I don't know another path.
That's great. Yeah. Go ahead.
So one comment, and perhaps it is farmers that could help, is that we have a thing in North America called urban sprawl. That is eating up farmland, and I've seen it eat up whole valleys. So maybe it is farmers that can re-educate city planners, but good luck. I've been trying to do it most of my life, and I have not succeeded. But, you know, something has to be done. Urban sprawl is a blight. Not everybody can have a big house and a big lawn, because at some point in time, they're going to be tearing those houses down and planting vegetables. At some point in time, that's going to happen.
Yeah, urban sprawl. Does anyone want to comment on urban sprawl?
Well, it was just what I said earlier about what we're seeing in those, you know, in our own areas. Here, Twin Falls, Boise, you know, we're covering up some of the very finest farm ground there is. And we've got to come up with an answer to that. And you're right, and I don't know that I have all the answers, but it is definitely an issue that's going to have to be dealt with.
I see 2 questions. Microphones are working their way to them, so we'll go down here in the front. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to pile on here and say it has been an extremely rich evening. You guys have offered a lot of inspiration, frankly. I'm walking out of here more with a smile on my face than when I walked in. But I do have a question that twists in my stomach sometimes, and I don't think we talked about it tonight. And that's the politics. I mean, you guys are dealing every 4 years, every 2 years, with new administrations, new people coming in with new ideas. And, you know, one year somebody wants to give back bear's ears and drill, baby drill. And the next year it's something else. And I just wonder how you deal with that uncertainty, and especially, I think Leslie, you mentioned about the conflict and where our world is now. And so much of what we're discussing tonight ends up in some kinds of regulation. And those regulations are dynamic and fluid, unfortunately. And I'm sure in each of your daily lives, there's uncertainty that puts a check on what you're doing. I just wondered if you might be able to address that briefly. Thanks, and again, thanks for this evening.
Yeah, so yeah, we deal with that all the time, of course. But the way that our organization tries to deal with that is to find the common ground that everybody in the real world on the ground actually can agree on. And it's amazing what happens. You can argue about things in the abstract all day long because we simplify things in our minds. And it's easy to turn it into black and white. You can argue all day long. But when you actually get out on the ground and you look at the piece of ground, you all gather around, you go, oh yeah, oh, there's an issue, but then what about this? And you begin problem solving together in a whole different way. And people have amazing insights that, are working on these complex systems all day. And so we try to find those things that just make good sense, and bring this movement to address these challenges more up from the ground than from the halls of DC, where we continue to argue in the abstract and in that sort of polarized sort of power play that's happening. And so a lot of the regulatory stuff sometimes is just, we need regulations. We do need some regulations, but some of it's just become so politicized that it does this crazy pendulum swing. So I think it's, solutions that are grounded, that are common sense. Common sense is a tough word, but that are commonly agreed on is a place that we can find some stability, and we find that a lot actually in our work. That's where we find both sides agreeing, and we're able to we just got a $400 million trust fund established in New Mexico to support conservation in a landslide bipartisan vote with stakeholder support from across the state. We were able to do that. I think that's going to stay in place. But it took that kind of a grassroots-driven approach, collaborative, grassroots-driven approach. So I think that's a piece of it. There's other mechanisms that we've thought a lot about how to get around that cycle. I'd be happy to talk about more at a different time. But I guess I'll pause there.
You talk about the politics of it, and we've dealt, we can say we're in the ranching game and we live our lives out in the country and we try to stay away from a lot of that, but we can't. I mean, especially in public land ranching, it's a political arena. It definitely is a political arena. And I'll give you an example. People will say to me all the time, gosh, isn't it great being your own boss? And I said, my own boss? I said, I got 27 bosses. I got BLM, I got Forest Service, I got State of Idaho, I got Labor Department, I got, just go on. What do you want? And, and an example, in our operation and many of the sheep industry operations, we use the Foreign H-2A worker program and to bring in foreign temporary workers. And some of the onerous regulations that come with that are something as extreme as if they come onto my operation today to do an inspection and there is a chipped windshield on one of my vehicles, that is a $1,000 fine per H-2A employee that you have. So when you hear these things in the newspaper about this guy got fined for 1,280, different things that he got fined for, it may be a fruit picking operation that has 640 employees, and he got fined for 2 things. And so those are some of the kind of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And you ask, how do we deal with it? Well, in my end of the world, we deal with it by calling our buddies and telling each other how stupid we are for taking the exposure that we take every day in these in these things, and kind of wind each other a little bit. But then truly what Leslie talks about, the collaboration, is the only way we're going to get back to this, because I worked for the industry many, many years back in DC and on the Hill and working on different issues. And H2A was one of the issues. And I don't know how many times back there I was told, you know, we could solve H2A tomorrow, but if we do, you're the only carrot holding the rest of the people at the table for comprehensive immigration reform. So we find ourselves caught in between some of these issues as well. And so what we started doing, and when we were back there, you know, if we'd had a little extra time, we'd start making cold calls into some of the Senate and House offices. And I happened to have a little time one day, and I was walking by an office of a congressman from New York, and I thought, yeah, why not? It's worth a shot. So I went in, and of course I assumed I would just talk to staff, and that's where we started out. And we were in the conference room, and turned out his office was right beside the conference room, and he overheard what we were talking about, and he came in, and he actually spent about 2 hours with me that day, and we talked, and he said, Mike, the only public lands I know or understand is Central Park. I said, that's the only thing I've ever seen. I don't know anything about your Western issues. I don't know anything about west of the Mississippi. And so we talked and we discussed some of the issues and why we do some of what we do, and he was extremely interested. And I can tell you that congressman voted with us on our issues from that day forward. We could count on him from that day forward. So it comes down to, but it takes manpower, it takes time, but it comes down to collaboration. And if we're going to come to a solution to these things, we can't just call our buddy and whine about how stupid we are. We got to actually do something.
Haley, did you have something you wanted to add?
Who would have thought the USDA scientists would have a comment on this? But I do. During the pandemic, I lived alone in a house in Juneau, Alaska, and I was a social scientist for the Forest Service, but I couldn't really leave my house to interview anybody. So I had all these testimonies that Region 10 of the Forest Service had gathered from all of the communities in Southeast Alaska in 2019 when Donald Trump proposed ending the roadless rule in Alaska. And because of the subsistence laws in Alaska, they had to go ask these communities, how would this change your subsistence harvest? And that was the only data set I had. So I sat in my house, and when you're doing qualitative, you read it over and over again, you listen, and you're just like in these people's lives for a long time. And we pulled themes out of them, you know, and we publish it, and we take it back to the community, say, did we hear what you said, and you know, what does the forest mean to you? Well, these folks had really straightforward common sense, you know, really deep meaning in their food system in the forest and the public land, and they were just really articulated about it. They had lots of science to back up their views. They had really deep knowledge of the landscape, and all of that had been missed by the preservation conversation and the logging industry, you know, economic argument that was being made to improve, you know, road access. There were 3 people in that data set of 198 that wanted more roads, and they just wanted to go hunting, and they're getting older, you know. So I think, you know, that was really grounding for me during that time because there was a lot going on in the world, and you know, that when you talk to local people about how they relate to the land, it's about, in that case, it was about salmon and berries and their families and their way of life. They say the Alaska way of life. They don't say subsistence. So I think sometimes we just focus on the wrong voices because the right voices are out there, and we can use science or we can use journalism or videos to hear those voices. But you know, I kind of, after that point, I was like, you know, I'm going to turn this other one down and start listening to what's going on around me. And that's been really helpful in my new job. When I came to the sheep station, I knew they'd work my tail off. They're out there at 6 in the morning, and I can't do it, you know, every day. But you just got to keep doing it and listening to the people who really need the land, I think, so.
So I think we have time for one more question. I see, yep.
Is this thing on? Okay, sweet, sorry. My question for you guys is, how are like indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge being used like to work towards sustainable working lands, and like how are we working as like modern, like people using modern strategies and modern techniques working with those people that have been on our lands for thousands of years and tending to our lands.
You know, just to give you an example in our area was a congregating area in the summer for the many different tribes that came out of several of the western states. They congregated there in that area and hunted and fished in that area and existed there for thousands of years. And when I talked earlier about in many of these instances of where we're moving back into what we once knew instead of where we were headed, they were big proponents of prescriptive fire in our area. We're high desert. We have a limited number of trees. What trees we do have are quake and aspen, which are stimulated by fire, and they would burn mosaically and in controllable amounts, but they would burn in the cool season as they left, maybe this drainage this year, that drainage another year, and they managed those lands with fire. And they were extremely productive. I mean, they lived because that's where those areas they hunted the next year, because the wildlife was in there. It was a smorgasbord for them. All the forbs that they wanted, all the brush and everything was coming that comes behind those fires. Well, we need to work back to some of that. I'm the chairman of the Rangeland Fire Protection Association in our area, and we started putting these in back in 2013 to actually fight fire. We actually fight fire with the BLM firefighters because we had gone from a time when fire was, when I was a kid in the 60s and the early 70s, 3,000 to 5,000 acres was a large fire, and then in the 80s, 30 to 50,000 acres, 80s and 90s, 30 to 50,000, till it became the 2000s. And at that time, a small fire in our area was 150,000 acres, and the large one was the Murphy Complex fire that burned 660,000 acres, over 1,000 square miles, took out 90% of our own personal BLM permits, brought many of us to our knees. And so there became the need to get back to an understanding of fire and get back to where we can control it in a mosaic and controllable amount. And yes, there's risks with it, but if we're doing a lot of things in building fuel breaks so we can compartmentalize these areas and maintain these fires in a smaller, more mosaic, just like the indigenous people did. And so I think, again, there's many of those opportunities to understand what they did and how they did it and why they did it. And we need to bring some of those back into our practices.
I would also say, broadly speaking, farming is done best, in my opinion, by observing your surroundings and looking at your system of food production as a part of a complex system of within nature and within the broader context of the land that you are working on. And so as much as a food producer can observe what's going on around them and look at the food production element of their business as a holistic element of that system. So can we, do conservation cover plantings that are going to increase pollinator populations on the property that can then help with, plant pollination and production of the crops? Can we do intensive grazing, which we never really got into, but intensive grazing of cattle and sheep, moving them around really quickly on smaller pieces of land in a way that mimics buffalo moving through the plain and actually is building soil over time instead of degrading it, and growing really healthy animals for meat production. Thinking about the health of the land and the watershed, and not thinking of food production as this thing that's disconnected from the bigger picture of the land stewardship, I think broadly speaks to kind of connecting back with indigenous ways and how land used to be used and managed.
Yeah, and gosh, there's so much to learn, and it's so complex. I mean, there's not sort of one indigenous way of being or relating, obviously. But one of the things that's been really increasingly helpful for me personally is this awareness that I've really come to over the course of my career, which is that there are different worldviews and that they're valid. They all have validity to them. But being aware of our own worldview helps us think maybe more broadly. And so, for example, I grew up in this environmental era that saw people as basically apart from nature, bad from nature, outside of nature. Nature needed to be protected from us. That is a particular worldview, if you will, and it's very much at odds with often what is rural or indigenous perspective, that we're part of nature. We're part of the landscape, and in some sense, we belong to it more than anything else. And so that worldview is very helpful to help rethink how we might be in relationship to the land, redefining our relationship to the land so that we're not only not bad for it, that we can find ways to be good for it, that we are, part of what gives back. Like I said earlier, pollinators and bees give back. We have the capacity to enrich the land, to be a productive part. I think if we begin to see ourselves in that way, which I think is essentially more of an indigenous way, we might be more responsible citizens to the land and to this community of the land. And, is our relationship, a lot of times people will equate conservation and recreation. I think many times they're actually the opposite, and we need to be very thoughtful about that. But is our relationship with land that we go out and we mountain bike on it, we get our workout, we get what we need from it, and we go home, is that the quality of relationship we want? When we're producing food, there's a more intimate relationship with the land. But even then, we have to think, are we just extracting from it, or are we giving back to it? How are we in relationship? So to me, that's where some of the indigenous perspectives have been personally very valuable and inspiring.
Okay, thank you for joining us tonight. We will be around for a little while longer, so please come introduce yourself, ask your questions if you have any remaining questions. Please give us one more round of applause for our panelists. And thank you.